And we are back on the build phase. I'm Mr. Ben, and today we are going to talk about Ms. Marvel. Carol Danvers, the pro registration main character that showed up in big numbers at Gen Con and even went on to win the entire event with a mirror match final table. Before I get into my thoughts and breakdown of how this main character works and why players have found so much success with her within the format, I want to give a shout out to all my patrons. It's with their support that we keep the lights on around here, and specifically the supporters at the Pro Mat Eclipse level and above: Roland, Peter, Patrick, Justin, Jason, and Brad. Much love. If you like what we're doing here, patreon.com/thebuildphase. You can join us in the coolest clubhouse in Versus. All right, so to the meat of today's topic, let's talk about Ms. Marvel. Now, this is not Captain Marvel, Carol Danvers. This is Ms. Marvel. So this is far enough back when Civil War happened. It's far enough back in Marvel comic history that there was still some of the stuff that would be labeled by today's standards as a little bit problematic, such as female superheroes wearing bathing suits into combat. I don't want to get super deep into any particular side on this issue, but I will suffice to say that I think the Captain Marvel costume makes a lot more sense for combat than the Ms. Marvel bathing suit costume, but I have a lot of nostalgia in my heart for this look on Carol Danvers. I grew up with this version of the character, so I acknowledge the criticisms that I can see through a modern lens. I understand the changes, but there is a part of me that really likes to have a main character with this version of the character in the card art, and it's also really good. So I like the way this card looks, but again, asterisks, I acknowledge the valid criticisms that could be made against this particular depiction of the character. Setting all of that stuff aside, let's talk about the actual mechanics on this card. So this is a flight and range character on your MC. Of course, she has 6 health because she was legal to play within the Life Goes On format. And within most formats, 6 health is kind of the where you want your main character to be at. A 5 health main character is starting off at a little bit of a disadvantage, and there's certainly main characters early in the game's history that are at that 5 health point, and it kind of renders them unplayable in combination with some other things about the card. So seeing a main character at 6 health is something I think everybody likes. If you like the character, you want them to have 6 hit points. You don't want them to be a 5 health chump. So that's a good start. Flight and range on on a main character is also great. Generally speaking, this opens up the ability to put you're not relying on your card draw to have a body in the front row that can protect your support characters in the back. So a non-flying main character that wants to set up a Wyatt Wingfoot or set up a machine or any other number of useful back row characters that you want to have sticking around for turn after turn. Match is another example. It's so much easier to protect them when your main character comes built in with that flying defense. Further, with range on your main character, this is also something you like to see, because when you hit that point of the game where maybe you've taken some wounds, you got a little bit beat up, and now you have to stop thinking about how you're going to protect your support characters in the back row, and you instead have to think about putting as much speed bumps, as much obstacles as possible in between your opponent and putting additional wounds on your main character, but you don't want to lose the efficacy, the combat skills of that main character. Range allows you to tuck them in the back row and still get value out of them within the combat step of the turn, but not necessarily leave them up front where they're more vulnerable to enemies' counterattack. So all of that's really good, and we haven't even gotten to any of the powers or the numbers on the card. Now, the numbers on the card are not so good. Carol starts off as a 3/3. So 3/3 on your main character is pretty bad overall. Generally speaking, those are stats that you don't want to see. But also, generally speaking, when you see those kinds of stats, it typically means that the character is going to have some kind of built-in way to pump their stats up, or they're going to have some kind of powerful effect that is the sort of trade-off for being such. If 1 drops can stun your main character, there has to be something else going on, or it's bad. And we know this card isn't bad. So what is it that allows this 3/3 main character to survive and thrive and dominate other MCs, with at least within the Life Goes On format? Well, let's get into her powers. Energy Discharge. Build phase. Pay a blue. Put 3 +1 counters on Ms. Marvel. She can only pay for this power with a blue from a location that appeared on your side this turn. Now that restriction is kind of relevant because it nukes your flexibility on when those blues are going to come down. So it puts you in the position of every turn when you pay the blue, you want to use it basically right away on your main character. You're never going to be sitting on these because once you sit on them for a turn, it's over. And you can't even wait until the main phase and necessarily see how combat goes, maybe feel out your opponent's hand. You have to commit to that blue right at the beginning. Now, the thing is, you want to commit to the blue. Because of Energy Manipulator, when a location with a blue symbol appears on any side or a character on any side uses a blue superpower, Ms. Marvel gains 1 XP. So if on turn 1 you pay a blue, so you play it, she gets an XP, you pay it to her build phase power, she gets 3 +1 counters and another XP. So you now have a main character who is a 6/6, which is a level 2 stat line for a lot of main characters. She is a 6/6 with 2 experience, and you haven't even recruited at this point. So she has the ability to get big very quickly, and much like some of the other aggro ladies that have dominated the low to the ground, super in your face kind of combat space, I'm looking at you, Rogue, she also relies pretty heavily on blues. Now, I'm of the mind that these kind of characters that absolutely live or die by whether or not they hit their colors, Kane is kind of a locked-in character for that deck. In my opinion, Kane is the most important card in your Rogue deck, and I would argue he would probably be the most important card in your Ms. Marvel deck, except that he was not legal in the Life Goes On format. And you can see in the tournament results, in the last episode, Osh talked about at least 2 games. I remember specifically him talking about Smallwood's game against Matt, where he said, I just didn't draw the blues. And that right there is why Kane is one of the most important cards you can put into these kinds of decks. But again, you didn't have that option available within Life Goes On. Now, I mentioned before that if you're going to counter this main character, if you know you're going to face this main character, your preparation actually has to start before you sit down at the table. And the reason for that is within her level up condition. Again, specify when a location with the blue symbol appears on any side, or when a character on any side uses a blue superpower. So that means if my deck strategy requires me to also be on blues, I am therefore feeding Ms. Marvel what she needs to become her level 2 version. Now, in a mirror match, you can see how explosive these Carol versus Carol games can go because you end up with both players pouring blues out to the row, as well as using the blues to level up. And you're leveling each other up, which is not ideal. So this is one of those cards where you have to approach the mirror match pretty carefully because the better you're doing, the better you're making sure your opponent's doing as well. And that is not what you want to do, especially when your opponent is somebody who could potentially outplay you, who's potentially put in more time with the character, might be a sharper player, generally speaking. Of course, that's not going to be every game you play, but let's not pretend that there isn't a lot of skill baked into this. So if you're making plays that are benefiting you 20%, but they're benefiting your superior opponent 20%, that's not a good trade. That's a lopsided trade in their favor. One of the ways you're able to beat a superior opponent is by trying to always choose the line of play that gives them the least extra advantage. Try to give them the opportunity to make a mistake. And this is one of those main characters where that becomes exceedingly difficult to do. Once you get to level 2, though, she retains flight and range and gets the stat line of the beast. She becomes a 6/6 and still has 6 hit points. She now has improved energy discharge, which is a build phase, pay a blue, put 6 +1 counters on Ms. Marvel. She can only pay for this power with a blue location that appeared on your side this turn. Now, this is notable because you really want to have some juice left over to become a 12/12. You know, she's a 6/6, you add 6 +1 counters. If you are putting all your blues into, like, let's say you're getting beat. Let's sketch out a thought experiment here. So on turn 1, I get my 2 XP, I get my 3 +1 counters, but my opponent's able to get to 6 damage or 6 attack and they stun me. So I lose all my counters. So now I'm a 3/3 again. So turn 2, I get 2 more experience and I'm a 6. Oh, but now I got knocked down again. So now at this point, I've already committed 2 of my 8 potential blue generating locations in the deck. Now you can't not commit those locations because you need the +1 counters in order to survive those early turns. 3/3 is frankly a pretty bad stat line, but you also need the blue superpowers to be going off in order to get the experience. So in your quest for experience, you are putting yourself in a position where you're going to have a diminished number of resources available at level 2 to keep pouring them into the improved energy discharge. So does that mean you tuck her in the back row? With her range, you can totally get away with doing that. You can maybe put the 6 counters on her this turn, hide her in the back row, have a bunch of stuff in the way your opponent can't get to her, and now maybe it doesn't matter that you're not able to generate the 6 counters on the following turn because they stuck around. Having that range, having that flight, it's just so crucial to it all plays together into what makes her a really powerful main character. So if you look at Osh's build, he went essentially all in on +1 counters by having the symbiote package. And I think there's a real logic to that, because if you look at the format, and really any format, there are going to be answers to +1 counters. There's going to be your even the odds. There's going to be your sonic disruptors. There's going to be your flint or your Terrax. So, and then to a lesser degree, a card like the 4-drop, gosh, what is this? Flash Gordon, but that, not Gordon. Flash Thompson's Agent Venom. He copies the opponent's +1 counters. Now, that's not as good. That's not a real answer in the pure sense. But nonetheless, regardless of what the format is, there are going to be ways of dealing with +1 counters. So the intuition that Osh had of running a bunch of other characters that will also generate a bunch of +1 counters essentially overloads your opponent's ability to deal with them, because you're only going to have so many answers in your deck. You're only going to be able to deal with big stacks of counters so many times. And if your opponent has the ability to stack counters one more time than you have the ability to answer them, well, you lose that game. That's just how it works out. Like, a lot of times, the Ms. Marvel matchup is going to come down to asking the question again and again, can you clear this stack of counters? Okay, well, can you clear this stack of counters? So overloading your opponent's answers is a totally viable way to play this character. Now, if you look at the other deck that made it to the final table, Ryan Milholland's version, he was basing his strategy on trying to essentially rush to Dark Phoenix and have this big kind of shut things off answer. You know, if you turn off +1 counters on Ms. Marvel, she's just a 6/6. Now, being a 6/6 at level 1, like turn 1 or 2 or 3, when she's a 3/3 +3/+1 counters, that feels really good. Being a 6/6 when your opponent has a 10/15 flyer with range out on the board doesn't feel as good. So there are different ways you can kind of handle the same approach. But at the end of the day, if you're playing her, there are some must plays. Obviously, you have to have 4 labs or 4 blue generating basics, as well as the 4 wilds. Having the option to turn on your locations again isn't really viable for her, because something like Monarch is no good. You can only generate +1 counters with her if you put the location into play this turn. So unlike other characters who might want to abuse reuse of the same locations a bunch of times, Carol is kind of gated off from that sort of shenanigans. If you really want to go crazy, if you're going into a format where you're expecting to see Ms. Marvel versus Ms. Marvel, somebody like Terrax can't be ignored. Grabbing the second chance format really drilled home in my brain how ridiculous that guy can get, especially now that symbiotes exist. And he does kind of a twofold thing. So I mentioned the Agent Venom, who copies the counters, and that kind of at least lets you hang with the character who has a big pile of counters, but it doesn't necessarily neutralize them. Something like a Sonic Disruptor really lets you neutralize them. Or other characters like Lilith would have, you know, Daisying somebody. So there are ways to deal with counters that just kind of remove them. And that's good. So you've got like copy is okay. Then you've got removal is good. And then you have Terrax, who's like a juiced up version of Flint. And he steals all the counters and then doubles them. So he's like the great version. So there's kind of tiers of how you want to worry about or factor in your plan for dealing with counters. Now, if all you do is fill your deck, like if you're going to face you're facing a Ms. Marvel, and all you're doing is filling your deck with this anti-counter tech, you're going to end up with a deck that probably doesn't work super good on its own. So what I always encourage people And sometimes I fall guilty to this kind of like loop de loop in deck building myself. So this is something other people have also encouraged me to do, is figure out what your deck does first. Get that locked in. Figure out what the core cards are. Like, what is it? What are the 6, 10, however many cards it is that are absolutely crucial? Okay, and then how many cards do you have to devote to the support structure of those absolutely crucial cards? And then how many slots do you have left over for counterplay? And generally, the anti-meta tech, the anti-green counter tech in the case of Ms. Marvel, is going to be the smallest chunk of slots in your deck. The main strategy package, the support packages, those are going to be the most important things. And you add in the tech cards at the very end. Now, tech cards are super important deck building. That can't be ignored. But if what you're trying to do is build a deck that has anti-tech cards for every other strategy, what you're failing to do is build the foundation of your own strategy. And if you don't run into, essentially what you're relying on is your opponent being willing to step into traps. You're going to be able to play this hate card. They're going to step into that trap and I win that game because they were going for a strategy that I could counter. But what about the games where somebody's doing a strategy you didn't predict, or knows how to be on the strategy you're trying to counter but play around the hate cards? Well, now what do? There's no real plan B because you're all on the disruption. So Ms. Marvel is one of those characters where you do have to devote a lot of your resources to her main game plan. Because if that's not going off, it's going to be bad news bears. If you're going against her, you're aware of what that game plan is, and there are some things you can do. Like, I don't think you necessarily have to build a deck with 0 blues in it. Just maybe only have blues for late game characters, like a turn 7 Moreland or whatever. That would still be, because by that point she's leveled up, so who cares? But what you don't want to do is feed her early game blues for sure. You want to be able to answer counters if possible. And then how do you deal with combats? Do you run, are you going to be on defenders and run super senses? Well, not in Life Goes On, actually, which it's so weird to think about a format without super senses, because that's been around since forever and has been legal in a lot of the formats. That was one of the things I did like about building for the Life Goes On format. While I did approach this with a much more casual mindset than I do typically with formats, and I didn't grind out like tournament level, like hardcore games, I played enough within the format that seeing the absence of some of these staple cards for certain team affiliations felt pretty good. I mean, it did feel a little bad that you couldn't run even the odds in a format with this Ms. Marvel main character running around, but there's plenty of other options, newer options. And on some level, you can't blame Upper Deck for wanting to structure formats in such a way to encourage the purchase of newer cards. On top of that, those older sets are getting harder and harder to find. So if Upper Deck's going to have formats where those older sets are legal, at a certain point, we do kind of have to spare a thought for the parts of the community that simply are going to be unavailable to find. Legacy, Predator, and like some of these are getting really difficult to find, which is, as someone who owns like 10 copies of the Predator expansion, it's funny to think about having that one hard to find. Like, I bought so many of them just because they were cheap. Okay, I got way off into the weeds. Overall, bullet points again to kind of sum up my thoughts. If you're playing as Ms. Marvel, I think Kane is crucial if you can play him. Almost as crucial as the blues themselves. But then you want to think about what your support package is. I think early in the game, having some of those low-cost support characters that you can hide behind when she's a 6/6 and up front kind of protecting is great. Late in the game, having some people who could maybe step to the front, something like a Terrax could both counterplay an opposing symbiote or Carol or whatever, but also benefit from your Ms. Marvel. I think those are all things that flow in with this. Lilith is a great, while it doesn't count as an early game character, I think that's still the kind of support character that hiding in the back row behind Ms. Marvel, I think makes a ton of sense. If you're playing against her, you don't want to have blues. You do want to have counter removal, and you're going to need some way to durably punch through her big numbers and get to those support characters. So you're going to want to go a little bit wider on the board. If you're assuming she's going to go big, you're going to need to be able to make multiple, because you might have to commit a team attack just to deal with Ms. Marvel if you don't hit your counter removal. Well, now, do you have any attacks left to deal with what's going on in the back row? Well, if not, that could be the kind of snowball, like losing the game an inch at a time experience that nobody wants to have. So, great main character. We saw some great play with her over Gen Con. Congratulations to everybody who made top 8. Of course, congratulations to Osh for taking the whole thing home. And until next time, go win some games.